Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the winter series of the education workshops at University of my name is Mengyan Liang. As the co-chair of the Education Workshop Planning Committee, I'm very honored to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jarek Schachner. Dr. Schachner is currently a postdoctoral scholar and Mansueto Fellow at the University of Chicago, where he is affiliated with the Department of Sociology and Mansueto Institute of Urban Innovation. Drawing on his interest in urban sociology, sociology of education, social stratification, public policy, and spatial analysis, Dr. Schachner's research examines whether and how neighborhoods, schools, and childcare settings mediate the intergenerational transmission of skills, health, and status, generating articles published in Demography, American Educational Research Journal, and Annual Review of Sociology. Before coming to UChicago, he completed his PhD in sociology and social policy at Harvard University, attended Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, worked at the New York City Department of Education, and consulted several national nonprofits, including the United Negro College Fund, Audubon Society, and Women's World Banking on their social impact strategies. Today, Dr. Schachner will present to us research on a widely held perception by the general public. That is, suburban schools are superior to inner city schools, the reality and the consequences of this spatial stratification statement. Before I turn the mic over to him, just to remind you all again, please feel free to unmute yourself during the presentation to ask questions or put your questions in the chat. Now let's welcome Dr. Jarek Schachner.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for the organizers of this workshop for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to finally be able to engage with all of you, even if remotely. So I'm going to present some early stage research today on a paper I've been working on. And because it's so early stage, it would be really helpful if, as was just noted, we engaged kind of in a back and forth. Feel free to chime in with any questions or comments, clarifying questions, whatever comes up. It'd be helpful if you actually kind of directly get involved in the conversation rather than holding it off to the end, because I want to make sure I'm understanding all of the input. Okay, and with that said, let's start diving into suburban schools superiority, perception versus reality for spatial stratification. So the borders demarcating core city from suburban school districts constitute some of America's strongest symbolic and structural boundaries. Many of you might be familiar with Jonathan Kozol's classic work, Savage Inequalities, which paints a very grim picture of conditions in inner city schools. This perception has really permeated throughout both the public imagination and also academic research in terms of how we portray schools within the inner city. On the flip side, suburban school districts have often been portrayed both in the public media and in academic research as much more appealing. This headline from the New York Times is one of countless headlines that seem to indicate that suburban schools such as these in New Jersey's are good, are widely perceived as superior, and are a key draw for parents looking for high quality environments in which to raise their kids. And beyond the headlines of the New York Times, we see similar themes emerging from the academic literature from LaRoe, Johnson, Holm, and others who use really in-depth qualitative research to show that parents report a desire to access suburban public schools and see them often as superior to otherwise accessible core city options. There have been a couple of very important studies recently that are more quantitative in nature that help to show what the impacts of these disparate perceptions are. So it's been well established from Sean Reardon and others that there's been an increase in income neighborhood segregation over the past couple of decades. What Ann Owens and others have shown is actually that increase has been concentrated among families with children. So if you look at families without children, other households, it seems like it's been a pretty flat trajectory in terms of income-based residential segregation. And it's really families with children where we're seeing the uptick. And what Ann Owen shows is that this uptick among families with children seems to be steeper within metropolitan areas that have more fragmented school districts. So when there's more access to kind of different suburban schools, it's in these places that high income parents seem to be walling themselves off residentially from lower income families. And so we might perceive this kind of evidence as an indirect suggestion that suburban schools are important and maybe increasingly important in driving residential decisions among households with children. So this is kind of the in lens on a longer term set of research that's looked at how suburban schools have allowed white parents to avoid minority parents. This is the income lens where richer parents may be trying to avoid poor parents via access to suburban schools. So, a core argument I think we can draw from this body of research is that suburban schools are widely perceived to be superior and they're highly desirable relative to core city schools. And so, the core research question I have here is, are suburban schools really all they're cracked up to be? Are suburban schools actually superior to core city schools when it comes to driving student learning? In other words, is the perception matched with the reality, or does empirical evidence suggest otherwise? As we think about answering this question, I draw on the Rodenbush and Wilms classic paper that helped us really deconstruct what it means to think about whether some schools are higher in achievement or quality than others. And this is kind of a version of what their argument is, that achievement for a given child in a given school of school practices, as well as school's environmental context, combined with the student's baseline background, right? These are kind of the three buckets of factors that might lead a certain child in a certain school to exceed achievement compared to another child in another school. So as we think about this kind of analytical framework, school practices might consist of administrative leadership, curriculum resources, and classroom instruction. So school level differences in those regards might be the school practices piece. School context might socioeconomic and racial composition of the school, as well as the neighborhood in which the school is embedded. That could affect achievement. And then, of course, student backgrounds such as preschool entry aptitude and socioeconomic resources can also produce the achievement outcome, even net of school level conditions. So Rodenbush and Wilms make an important point here, which is that there are kind of two ways to think about deconstructing school quality. You can take the parent's perspective or look at type A school effects. And the core question is, would my child do better in the core city or a suburban school that's otherwise similar? Absent random assignment of children, we have to compare how students with similar backgrounds score on academic achievement tests in core city versus suburban schools. The key here is that it's not very important whether that effect is driven by the school's instructional practices or the kind of the school's social context and environmental conditions. That is not really the material question. The question is whether these sets of two buckets produce higher levels of achievement for one set of kids versus another set of kids who are very similar in terms of their backgrounds, right? That's the key axis that we're looking at. And that should be contrasted with what a policymaker might think about when they're thinking about school quality. The question here might be, are instructional practices in suburban versus more effective? So here the random assignment ideal is not about placing different children in different schools. It's looking at if we could kind of randomly assign school practices or instructional practices that are more or less effective. And we have to make sure that we isolate the effect of those school practices from the contaminating effects of school context, such as neighborhood and school sociodemographics. If we can isolate that school practices piece and figure out which schools are using the best practices to bolster student achievement. Now, they make an important point in this article that these type A effects are much easier to measure because we don't have to kind of drill down into the practices specific proxies. It's very hard to get high quality measures of school practices specifically. all we have to do for the type A effect to measure it appropriately is basically net out the background and really highlight whether the combination of school practices and school context together produces better outcomes for kids. Okay, so that's kind of the basic analytical framework I'm going to be working with. Again, it's not really the policymaker's perspective, and we can talk about that at the end. I'm really trying to think if you're a parent and you're looking at the margin, whether your kid would fare better in a core city school or a suburban school, which would be the better outcome. Okay, before I dive into theoretical accounts that help us think about those type A school effects, are there any clarifying questions that would be helpful to address? Okay, looks
Well, I think I do have a question. Does it make sense to separate school practices or school context? Or, should we think of school practices as being optimal given a certain in one context, but not in another?
right. I think that's a really important point. I think you'll see that the interactions between each of these pieces is a core part of the literature that's not thoroughly examined yet. I think this is more kind of just like a very simplistic analytical framework that we can work with to think about the different factors, different inputs that matter. But I think in future work, we need to think about how those interactions matter, right? So it's not only that school practices might interact with school context, it's that school practices might interact with student background, context might interact with student background, and that's a key path for future research. So I will talk at the end a little bit more about heterogeneity. I don't have very strong priors on that question now. I just want us to analytically, for now, think about school practices and school context as potentially different levers that affect the achievement outcome, even if they end up interacting.
Yeah, so just one comment. I think as long as the interactions involve practice and context, then it's all part of that indistinguishable set of things.
That's right.
That the parent hopes are good, and so it doesn't it doesn't hurt you at all with respect to the type A if there are those interactions, and in fact the interactions involving different subsets of students are not particularly much more difficult to estimate than just the average effect. In other words, it's easy, it's not easy, but it's straightforward to conceptualize how to estimate the effect of attending a school on kids from different backgrounds. So I think your framework holds up fine, even if those interactions exist.
Right. I think that's a crucial point, that when we're thinking about parental kind of perceived effects, presumably most are agnostic whether the effect is driven through the school practices or school context or the interaction channel. They just want to make sure their kid is better off over the long term, regardless of the particular mechanism. I think it's when we start thinking about the policy implications and what the policymakers have to do that we have to drill down to that level of specificity of main and interactive effects. But as Steve just stated, for now, it's fine. I'm a parent. I just want to know in total whether my kid will do better in one place versus another. So when we think about the structural account, this is not going to be much of a surprise to anyone what it predicts. What the literature shows, especially within sociology, if we theorize what practices matter and what school contexts are better and worse, and we look at achievement levels, suburban schools across the board seem to do better across all of those metrics. So if we look at schools' average test scores, they're generally considerably higher within suburban public schools than they are in core city schools. And if we look at outcomes, not just in terms of test scores, but high school graduation rates, one study finds that they're 15 percentage points lower in urban versus suburban schools. So whether we look at those achievement measures or school context measures that might be theorized to matter for achievement, suburban elementary schools are twice as white, according to this John Logan and Burdick Will paper. On average, they have half as many Black students and considerably fewer free or reduced price lunch eligible students. So there seems to be this common kind of pattern across the data that in terms of achievement, school context, as well as the types of practices within schools that we think might matter, whether it's student-teacher ratio or teacher credentials, suburban schools almost invariably rank higher in terms of the levels of those factors. So this basic theoretical framework would lead us to this deceptively simple answer, which is that suburban schools would outperform core city schools. And there is some kind of more direct evidence that this is the case, right? So instead of just looking at cross-sectional descriptives, if you look at cross-sectional correlations, there are during the 1990s that suggest that racial composition of the school and the school poverty rate seem to be significantly associated with individual students' performance. Right, so the hypothesis here is probably what we would expect to see based on the New York Times, Jonathan Kozol, et cetera. Suburban schools are better than core city schools, and there's maybe little reason to kind of probe this more deeply. I think there's been a real revolution in the past 20 years in terms of approaching this structural account. And this hinges on the idea of selection bias and causal inference. Of course, suburban schools may achieve higher average test scores, but that's not necessarily due to anything about the schools that's more or less effective. That could just be a compositional effect, right? If you have more advantaged students who perform well on tests prior to school entry, why would we credit suburban schools with that kind of those kind of high scoring outcomes? If it's really just that, white and high income parents are disproportionately likely to move to the suburbs for whatever reasons, the schools that they end up in look better because they're more resource groups. So that's if we look at kind of the school context piece. And I want to be clear that the school practices piece is also less clearly established than we once thought. Often we kind of assume that we know that schools with higher per pupil funding, more credentialed teachers, lower teacher to student ratios, that those are factors that are causally related to the quality of education and achievement. But there's actually been limited direct examination and clear knowledge of those practices' effectiveness on skill development. So for both of these reasons, I think we need to be careful in just assuming suburban schools are superior. And so what we really need in kind of a rigorous analytical approach is we need to think about how we can leverage randomization and experiments, as well as quasi-experimental data via student fixed effects, marginal structural models, seasonal comparison models, and value-added models to get a clear sense of this isolating these type A effects, right? So instead of just trying to look at different levels across suburban and core city schools, we need to isolate somehow, strip out the selection bias and see whether the schools themselves are more or less effective in a suburban or core city context. And I think interestingly, we'll see from that literature that's more recent, once we take care of some of those threats to causal inference, a different story emerges. So that's really going to be the punchline for the rest of the talk. So Dave Demings, I think, provides one of the most compelling empirical analyses that underscore this point. What he does here is he looks at Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina, and they used a school choice lottery data there to figure out enrollment for oversubscribed schools. So if you won the lottery, you could get access to an oversubscribed public school. And if you won the lottery, you got access to that school. Typically, those schools you got access to had much higher average test scores, right? And those average test scores we know are salient to parents, and also in the literature, those scores have been used to assess that suburban schools are superior to core city schools. Crucially, Dave Deming finds that winning a lottery and attending a school with a higher average test score provides trivial score boosts 1 year later. The average test score alone contains almost no information about schools' causal effects. So this is using an experimental gold standard, and it's showing that the average test score treatment provides almost no traction to understand the child's subsequent outcomes. If we look at quasi-experimental data, which is of course more complicated sets of analyses, we come to a pretty similar conclusion. So Doug Downey has done a set of studies using seasonal achievement. He looks at comparisons between school year achievement and summer learning rate to see if your school year learning rate kind of sets you on a higher skill trajectory than what you're expected based on your summer learning rate when you were out of school. And by isolating schools' effects in this manner, he shows that those kind of value-added effects of the schools are only correlated 0.16 with score level. So there seems to be very little kind of bivariate correlation between those highly publicized test score level measures and the kind of causal or potentially causal school effect on the kids' learning. Marginal structural models tell a similar.
Jared, can I ask one question about that? If you translate that into that 0.16, which looks like a pretty small number,
Yeah.
but you can't translate that into a binary impact, which I'm not exactly, I mean, you know, people have done that, but would
Yep.
that still be though, would that still be pretty substantial though? Of, you know,
Yeah.
in other words, what I'm trying to say is, yeah, it looks like a small correlation, but in terms of actual effect sizes, would that be still really trivial?
That's a good question. I can't answer that definitively, but I think if we look at the totality of the work beyond just seasonal comparison, I'm hard pressed to find any study that shows that average test score levels, once we adjust for confounding, selection bias, et cetera, exerts a strong effect on kids' learning. That measure does not seem strongly linked once we link it to individual children's trajectories. And I think we see this in a lot of different methods, which is encouraging, right? It doesn't seem to be contingent on the type of method. And I think if you look at, Jeff Wadke's work and Lowen and Gaddis using a different type marginal structural models, you just don't see kind of the average score level or the school poverty level producing any clear effect on children's achievement.
Yeah, no, I certainly, I'm very, I think that's a really great point. And bullets, I was really just wondering about, I wasn't quite sure what to make of the first bullet.
Yeah, I wish I could give you more clarity in terms of what that would look like, and if we kind of just predicted a child's long-term outcome based on the seasonal comparison based impact measure.
Yeah.
I can't answer that for you right now, but it's a good question that I might bring to Doug at some point to get clarity on what this really means.
Yeah, there's an old paper by Rosenthal and Rubin about translating correlations into binary effect sizes that what look like pretty small correlations can actually be pretty significant.
Yes, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah,
And so
right. Okay.
this might be understating the relationship, but I think if we look at other places, it's hard for me to think of a study that really pins down an average school test score level effect on kids. And I know in my own work, looking at Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Survey longitudinal analyses, which I'll get to a little later, that average score level tells me almost nothing about how the kid's trajectory looks like, what it looks like.
Yeah.
Steve, if I can interject, maybe another way to think about that Downey result is they also come up with a definition of like a failing school based, I think it's on the bottom quartile of the distribution of first achievement levels and then impact. And I think they find that something like, like 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 of schools that would be classified as failing on the achievement-based measure would look just fine, right?
That's right.
I'm not really quarreling with the finding. I totally agree with you. I've done a lot of work also on looking at cross-sectional means versus value added, and I've seen exactly the same thing. I just think it might be interesting to dig a little deeper into that one bullet, simply because that's a pretty cool quasi-experimental design. And to really know, I really like where this paper is going. I don't want to be, and I actually am very sympathetic. I just think that it might be worth looking to that a little more deeply, because that work is pretty interesting in terms of trying to tease out some causal effects of schooling.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to keep in mind the seasonal comparison type of work is probably the best shot we've got in terms of getting at, with that, in the absence of a randomization model a randomization design or experiment. The seasonal comparison work, I have a lot of respect for that design. The challenge that I'm about to get to is that those data are fairly rare. And so in terms of in practice, especially when we're trying to look at a huge distribution and looking at it spatially, it's hard to kind of emulate the seasonal comparison design, right? So we kind of have to think about these suboptimal, but potentially still viable approaches to isolate these causal effects.
Right.
I'll get to that in a moment. But the last thing I want to show here is that we're seeing some convergence on these kind of experimental and quasi-experimental studies that average levels of achievement, school poverty levels, racial composition provide minimal traction in understanding a child's achievement. And we're also seeing, which I think aligns with that, finding that the traditional proxies for school practices, like per pupil expenditure in some cases, teacher training, do not strongly predict schools' causal effects. So Dobby and Fryer show types of things like teacher feedback, data-driven instruction, and higher expectations, these kind of trademarks of the charter school movement, those factors, some charter schools, those factors seem to be more predictive of schools' causal effects than the traditional measures that people have claimed that suburban schools are better resourced and therefore more effective. So we're seeing across the board a lot of our assumptions, this whole edifice upon which suburban school superiority has been built, we see this kind of eroding a bit. And I actually think that there's possible not only that suburban schools are not superior, but I think there's also a potential argument that core city schools are superior in terms of causal effects on achievement than suburban schools, especially in light of Dobby and Fryer's argument here, that it's the kind of based reforms that core cities have disproportionately invested in, not only via charter schools, but via some traditional public schools, that data-driven instruction, increased kind of instructional support, professional development, that some core city schools might actually outperform suburban schools because they have more kind of actively embraced those types of evidence-driven changes, okay? So this is just, kind of the counter argument to the traditional expectation. And I am going to now move into my empirical approach to try to test between hypothesis 1, saying that claims that suburban schools are better, and hypothesis 2, that claims core city schools are potentially better on average.
Jared, maybe this is a question better for like the discussion, but since you motivated this sort of from like the parental like decision theoretic framework of like where should I send my kid to school? I mean, parents, like when you boil it down, don't care that much about achievement per se, and they're more worried about like status and
that's right.
Does their kid who likes hockey have a hockey rink at the school, or
that's right. I think that's a crucial point. I think that's something where in the paper I want to bring as a key discussion point. I think this paper is built under the assumption, and I think it's a well-justified assumption when you look at the qualitative studies, that parents want to maximize achievement for their kids. This is like key to the reproduction literature, that they really want to see their school produce a causal effect on their kids' outcomes. However, I'm not so sure what they're saying is necessarily the truth, right? So I'm totally on board with, maybe they don't, even if they saw compelling evidence of core city schools providing better achievement, they might say, well, I want my kids to have a rich white social network because that probably, would matter for other outcomes. I think that's a broader set of questions that need to be asked. I think if you look at the experimental literature, when you bring in value-added estimates into like a school assessment, a parental school assessment experiment, you see that those value-added measures don't always drive decision-making, right? So I think empirical evidence that you're right, they care about some of these shorthand things related to culture or perceptions of culture. So I think it's something that warrants extended discussion, potentially at the end of this paper, but right now, in terms of my framework here, I don't have a clear way of bringing it in, right?
I think that there's even been some work done here, like through the consortium, that shows that like even when schools do publish their results, like parents really aren't able to like interpret what these mean when they're
That's
making these decisions. So like
Exactly.
beyond saying like, okay, you've told me that, I think it's just hard for them to sort of tease out like what the data mean. Like they're not researchers, right? So I wonder to some extent if
I think
that's
that's
part of the story.
a super crucial point, and that speaks to some of the work I've done elsewhere in terms of how parents make decisions. I think the whole kind of edifice of school choice was predicated on like, well-informed consumers who could sift through information and really hone in on what matters. And I just think that more and more research suggests that's not the case. And then it's not clear if it's kind of the Jeff argument where their preferences are actually not about those measures, or it's a kind of informational processing constraint. I think it's potentially both. But those measures, especially value-added measures, are asking a lot of parents in some ways. I don't think the intuition of selection bias is obvious to most, maybe the most highly educated parents potentially can discern that. But I think most of us look for shorthand for quality. And you can't really blame them for looking at average test scores because that is the most intuitive measure. So I'm totally on board with what you're saying, Kaylee, and I think you've exposed kind of the key challenge here with school choice and parental decision making. Okay, any next questions before I show you how I empirically intend to test these hypotheses?
I have a question.
Yes, of course.
The question is, does racial panic or status anxiety, desire to, avoid feared bad influences, downward mobility, et cetera,
Yep.
is that captured by one or two of the other explanations you were referring to? It's a little.
I think that's a crucial part
different.
of what really matters for parents' decision making. Again, this speaks to some of the other work I've done and the other work I've reviewed, is that parents are, I think, making decisions in a lot of ways based on these concerns about kind of racial minority avoidance or kind of peer sorting.
Yeah.
This paper is intended to kind of expose that a little bit by showing actually those decisions are often coming at the expense of quality. And this sets us up to think about opportunity hoarding in a more nuanced way. And that's how I was going to kind of end the talk, which is that when we kind of think of opportunity hoarding as this monolithic thing, but actually some parents are making decisions that may be perceived as opportunity hoarding, but they're actually trading up in terms of, race and SES, but they're trading down in terms of actual school quality. It's kind of a clear, a more nuanced picture of what's going on. Right? Those things don't go hand in hand, in other words. Like minority avoidance does not guarantee you a higher quality school. In fact, it might get you a lower quality school.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to shift now from the theoretical piece, and we can continue to come back to the framework, but I want to show you how I am trying to bring some empirics to bear on this question. And I also want to admit that it's very hard to do this because we don't have many randomized experiments where we can just allot different students to a suburban versus core city school. So here I build on the 20 to 30 year tradition of building value added models to assess teachers and schools quality or approximate estimates of their causal effects on cognitive skill development. The core intuition here is that I'm going to compare schools' demographically adjusted test score gains. And the idea here is that schools that achieve higher rates of growth in terms of test score gains after adjusting for differences in their student demographics are assumed to be superior. And what that translates to, maybe in more concrete terms, is that a school's value added measure is just the residual score gains, right? So if we subtract the actual growth that their students achieve over time from the predicted growth that we would expect based on their socio-demographic characteristics, that gap, the larger that gap, the more value added that school is providing. So hopefully that's a somewhat intuitive interpretation for us, maybe not for parents. Again, this is the key challenge. We have kind of how researchers make sense of this, but for researchers, this is the approach. And I think recent research has made us much more confident in what these measures are telling us. There's been a long back and forth about whether these kinds of statistical adjustments actually at all tell you something about the causal effects of schools. Two recent papers, I think, have gone a long way in assuaging our concerns here. So Deming finds, as I mentioned this paper earlier, estimates line up very closely with estimates of school effectiveness based on lottery-based random assignment. And Angrist et al. Come in with another paper just a few years ago in Massachusetts that comes up with a pretty similar story. So while this statistical approach I'm going to walk you through is not going to give you the perfect causal effect, it looks like it's getting you pretty close. So we are able to kind of connection bias to large extent by controlling for a set of factors I'll walk you through. Okay, so I'm going to build one of the larger kind of value added data sets that's out there in the empirical work. The core backbone of the study is the California STAR database. And this was a database constructed by the California Department of Education starting in the early 2000s that shows how student cohorts rank in terms of their math, English language, and other standardized test scores over time. So you're looking at student cohort change in terms of their average math scores or percentiles relative each kind of grade school combination. You see how those cohorts change over time. I'm going to focus here on the 2004 to 2005 through 2012 to 2013 school year. So that's a pretty long, for these studies, it's a pretty long period of time that I'm able to track different school grade level cohort combinations. And so the key variables here is to track how that student cohort performs relative to the math percentile that they rank in a given year, while controlling for the prior year's math and English language percentile at the cohort level, right? So I'm tracking change in the cohort's trajectory over time. So that's the backbone, but I also need to control for the sociodemographic composition of the school, because we know from a lot of literature that higher SES students tend to accumulate skills at higher rates, regardless of what school they go to. And so you can't penalize schools necessarily for having students that progress at slower rates or faster rates. And to address this, I incorporate controls for the percentage of the school that's Asian, Black, Latino. I have a socioeconomic proxy with the free or reduced price lunch measure, English language learning. And the California Academic Performance Index also allows me control for parents' educational attainment, which is not always the case in administrative data sets, as well as an annual measure of student mobility. So I have a pretty rich set of controls for every school. I use the time invariant measures, so kind of averaging across this entire time frame, because there's so little variation in these measures over time, maybe changing that structure. And then the last data I bring in is just an area deprivation index, and I'll talk more about what this provides. This is not built into the actual value-added model that I construct. Instead, it allows us to look later at, once we control for different types of kind of neighborhood SES, whether the core city suburban comparison looks different when we're comparing rich suburban neighborhoods to rich core city neighborhoods versus low income suburban neighborhoods to low income core city neighborhoods, right? Because in LA, in California and elsewhere, there's a lot of low income suburban neighborhoods and also high income urban neighborhoods, right? So we need to think about that distribution if we're taking this parental sorting lens to understand school quality.
Well, I'm a little confused, Jared, about this. I would have thought with a value-added model, you'd be controlling for student level characteristics, not the school level characteristics.
Yeah, so this is the major shortcoming of this data set. So what we get in kind of the length and size of this data, the publicly available data set forces me to look at change across cohorts versus change at the micro level individual students. Now, that's of course an important concern, but there, I think, are a couple things that make us feel better that we're actually capturing what's going on at the micro kind of student level. One is that these are young kids. So if there's presumably less attrition from year to year than there would be for high school students who might be dropping out and therefore contaminating the effects. We've also seen enhancement and feel who have a social forces paper, they use a similar approach looking at these school student cohort combinations to show that once you kind of do a robustness check that looks at student sorting from year to year, it doesn't really contaminate the results. So this student cohort
I have a
change.
different question a little bit though. The question is whether you really want to control for these aggregated things. So
I see, right.
in that same paper that you mentioned with Wilms,
Yep.
talked about the problem when we've got practice correlation that
Yep.
you can't solve because you don't have a measure of practice.
That's right.
You estimate the effects of these. You try to use regression to remove. I'm not sure if you're going to use regression, but to remove these aggregated things. But you're not adjusting for practice, so you don't necessarily get the right coefficients on those things. And then you might be introducing a bias, and it's not clear that you need those things for the type A effects. So
that's an important point.
You might actually be introducing rather than removing control.
I think that's an important point, and I think that I've actually run the model both ways in the paper. So I've run it once without these pooled means of the sociodemographics, and one with. I'm somewhat encouraged by the fact that there's a 0.8 bivariate correlation with, for school level value added based on whether or not you adjust for these time invariant sociodemographics. My concern is that if you look at cohort to cohort change, that change is conditional on the composition of the cohort, right? So you would expect more growth from cohort to cohort in suburban schools just by virtue of the fact that those cohorts are richer and wider. And so I need to figure out some way to look at cohort change that's adjusted for those compositional differences. Otherwise, I get the CETA data, like Sean Reardon's kind of national map of cohort to cohort change that's not adjusted. And I think it might tell us something that doesn't really address the selection bias concern.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is an important point. I think running it in different ways and ideally having a cohort level measure of racial and socioeconomic composition could help. I also have applied to the California State Department of Education to get the student level data. So that could help me here address your concern, but it's something I have to come back to that I'm not fully resolved on. And Jeff, do you have something to add there?
I just have a question about using about the outcome variable here, these percentiles or these like mean percentile ranks.
Yep.
I haven't fully thought through this. And I know we talked a little bit about this before, but I was thinking about it a bit differently at the time because I didn't realize that you were focused on percentiles. But isn't there like a ceiling and floor, a special ceiling and floor issue with growth and percentiles, which are like order statistics?
Right. So I think this is an important concern. I think there's actually a lot of variation in the literature in terms of how to approach this. I basically saw half the papers use percentiles and scaled scores. My concern was that since I'm covering such a long time frame when there were changes to the way the tests were constructed, I wanted to make sure that my results were not contaminated by changes in how kind of the content of the assessments and how they were scaled. Now, I rerun all the analysis using the scaled score that it sounds like you would prefer. And I get very high correlations between the school value added using those scaled scored versus percentiles. I just thought the percentile was intuitive, but I hear you on your concern about.
Well, I guess I'm just thinking like, again, it's a bit more complicated because these are like averages, but, like if you're a school that's at the, top of the rank distribution of test scores at time t, right? You have nowhere to go but down, essentially.
Yeah, and I think some people have approached this differently. I mean, we talked earlier about using squared and cubic, controls to hopefully to address this somewhat, I think Hanselman and Phil do, what they basically do is only look within deciles. They basically have a fixed effect for the decile from which you start. So only kind of top schools at baseline are compared to top scoring schools, bottom scoring schools the same. What I'm encouraged by is even when I incorporate those types of changes or those types of modification to the modeling, they're correlated 0.99 in terms of the school's value added effects. So I don't think I've necessarily resolved this concern about ceiling and floor, but I am encouraged by the fact that I'm seeing such consistency across different tweaks to the model.
And the concern with just the raw scores is like they're not designed to measure growth, and there's been changes in their administration across cohorts. Is that right?
That's right. I'm concerned, especially with California, that has a habit of changing things all the time, especially when it comes to standardized testing, that between 2005 and 2010, 2012, there were a lot of tweaks being made to these tests. And I'd rather try to kind of, mitigate against those concerns by just using the percentile with a clear interpretation, right? We can say, okay, the way you might interpret it too, in terms of the very advantaged schools, is that it is an accomplishment to kind of stay at the top, to drop less than others, right? So if there's this like kind of reversion to a lower score, the advantaged schools that are losing the least over time because they're already at the top, I think we could say are doing better than the schools that are eroding over time from starting at the top. So I in terms of how you interpret it.
I had one clarification question. I think that you've probably already addressed this, but something I'm trying to wrap my head around is like part of the reason for using like the seasonal comparison studies, right, is to try to sort of isolate the school effects. But here you're doing like a year-to-year comparison. So isn't it including some of that like summer group, which could be, like the family effects? Like, are you accounting for that by doing the pooled means, or where does that sort of come in here?
Right. I think there's no question that is contaminating, to hopefully a modest extent, these measures. However, I think that goes back to this concern about controlling for sociodemographics, especially at the cohort or student level. Presumably,
Right,
some of that contamination is addressed by adjusting for those demographics, because I think we can think about summer learning rates as being more similar among people with similar sociodemographic and racial backgrounds. So I don't have a great answer there, but again, something that we need to think about throughout is, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good when we're thinking about large scale administrative data. Our goal should always be to have, the most well-identified effects. But at the end of the day, especially when we think about parent assessments of schools, we have to work with what we have and what's the best we can do with what we have. And I think encouragingly, Dave Deming, John Ingres, and others show that this imperfect value-added approach gets us very close to other types of measures based on randomization. But they're not perfect, and I don't claim that they are.
Can I ask one more follow-up question? Yeah. I'm just curious, like, do you think that like doing some type of sort of similar analysis with the ECLSK data, either the older one or the more recent one, would be a way to sort of say some of the same things here?
Yes, except I'm concerned that what we would give up a lot of kind of the size of the data set, right? So I'm not sure we'd be comparing the right people. We could kind of nest all of these children in those longitudinal data sets into a suburban or core city bucket, but presumably a lot of them are not living in the same metropolitan area or commuting, right? And therefore that comparison is less meaningful. I'm not comparing LA suburban public schools to Chicago inner city schools. This data set allows me to look at LA suburban city schools to LA core city schools, because I think that's really the axis upon which these decisions are being made. So I think it's a more realistic description of how parents are evaluating their options, right? But there are these important I need to be clear in the paper about the trade-off that I'm making.
Could you explain again your data structure? So you mentioned, 3 grade student cohorts over this 8 or 9 years of span. So are you saying you have, for every cohort, you have 3 years of data from 3rd grade to 5th grade, and you don't follow them beyond 5th grade, and you don't have information before 3rd grade. So you have multiple cohorts, like maybe a dozen cohorts or 10 cohorts.
Yep.
So what is the advantage of having so many cohorts? The trade-off of information before and after that 3-year period. Okay,
let me make sure I'm understanding correctly. First, I want to clarify that I'm using 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, but I have information on the second grade math achievement. So for each of those cohorts, I have their baseline score measures. So it's really kind of 4 years. But are you saying why not just focus in on like a smaller set of cohorts over time?
No, it's a good thing that you have previous years, like 2nd grade. If you have 1st grade data, that's even better. So you have the previous trajectory. But what is the advantage in that? I'm sure there's advantage. That's why you're using so many years of data. But could you explain to us what is the advantage of using these multiple cohorts?
Right. So one thing that I think has really become correct me if I'm not addressing your question, but something I want to bring up here is that a major concern with the value-added framework is that, especially when it comes to schools, they're noisy measures. So if you only look at one cohort within a school, it might not be very highly correlated with the subsequent cohort coming through the school in terms of the value-added estimates that emerge from those. That's been, Kane and Stager have long said this. They said, are you really kind of measuring anything stably different about schools, or is there so much random noise and small effects that it's pretty much meaningless? And one thing they show, and something that my colleague and I found in a subsequent, when you link multiple cohorts within the same school together, you get much more kind of stable and I think defensible school value-added measures. If you can combine 2 or 3 cohorts within a school, that ends up being correlated, like 0.8 to the next kind of groups of cohorts. So I think you address some of this longstanding concern in the educational policy literature that these kind of single cohort measures are meaningless. And teacher value added has especially been prone to this. People are saying, if you only look at one cohort within a classroom, like the teacher's height is as predictive of that value add as anything else, right? So you have to use multiple cohorts to make sure that these measures are actually telling you something about stable differences.
So do you assume that these value added would be relatively stable over these 8 years? Because there could be major changes in a district.
That's a crucial. So for this paper and the research question, I'm not really thinking about the trajectories or change. I'm trying to create the most kind of robust and defensible measure of school value added, which in my view encaptures maximizing the time frame and the number of cohorts. I want the most data points possible to get the most defensible estimates. However, I think subsequent research should look at these temporal dynamics, and I would be comfortable comparing maybe 2 to 3 cohorts at a time. I don't think looking at from one cohort to another, I think there's risks that you get too much noise, right? And so my individual cohorts are correlated 0.5 from year to year. So I think that's decent. I mean, in terms of the school value added estimate, that's decent, but I think combining multiple cohorts is better. I think in the future, we should think about chunks of cohorts and looking at temporal trajectories in that way.
Thanks.
Sure. I'll go more into the nitty gritty of the estimate strategy next, if that's okay, and then we can get into any additional questions. So these are the primary data sources. Let me show you, and I think what we were just talking about might help us think about what the data structure actually looks like. So if you look at just one elementary school, in this case, this is real data from the West Hollywood Elementary School. I'm looking at what I call the 205 cohort. So these are second graders who in the year 2004, 2005 scored an average of 54 on the math in that first year at the school. Then 1 year later, they were third graders and they scored 60, right? 1 year after that, they scored 62, and their final year, they got a 73. And so what's most interesting in terms of the model is the change, right? So you're looking at within the first year, second to third grade, they grew 6 points, then 2 points, then 11 points, right? And that's the kind of trajectory I'm trying to track in this data set. Of course, as I mentioned, you want to have multiple cohort years. And so the data set really proliferates in size as I look at every single cohort that started in the year 2004, 2005, and afterwards. I look at their trajectories over time within the school. Okay, so you end up getting a pretty large data set. You have 3 different kind of grade timelines, second to third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth. I have 8 academic years. And when you combine these all together across 54 schools, you have 114,973 grade academic year school combinations. So you end up stacking up a lot of data through this kind of tracing school cohorts over time through that strategy. And this is, again, a very large administrative data set. When I translate that data structure into a model, it's a 2-level HLM, which going back to Steve's work and other HLMs are often used, hierarchical linear models are often used to kind of decompose the variance in math or educational achievement scores to between and within school components. So level 1 is, as I mentioned, that school cohort academic year grade combination. So I'm looking at that cohort's math percentile in a given year as a function of their math percentile in the prior year, right? Like a lag dependent variable, while also controlling for their English language arts percentile in that prior year. So I have 2 different skill measures that help me net out some of the compositional selection bias effect on differences in test scores across schools. So adjusting for baseline skill levels is a key piece of this. And some studies have shown that just controlling for math percentile in the year prior is necessary, but not sufficient. You want to try to get other measures built into this model to reduce the noise. Level 2 is really the key here. So what I'm trying to do is adjust at the school level for the socio-demographic measures that I mentioned that I have, right? And so once you adjust for at the level 1 baseline skill levels, level 2 students socio-demographics, what's left is the residual variance is the random effect, right? So if you look at level 2, you can generate best linear unbiased predictors, BLUP, which is the elementary school random effects generated from the level 2 portion of the model. And these are constructed to have mean 0 and the variance is the intercept. And there's a pretty clear interpretation of what this random intercept is telling you. So for each school, the intercept tells you, or the random intercept or the value added measure is telling you the school's over or underperformance on math scores relative to the score we would expect based on its students' baseline skill levels and socio-demographics, right? So this is the residual piece. You're looking at how they're performing relative to what we would expect. Schools that are outperforming expectation are considered higher in value added, and schools that are underperforming are considered lower in value added. Now, we've touched on some of these concerns with the value added framework, and I'm going to just come back to some of these concerns. So many people have said, including Kane and Stager, that the size of these residual school level effects, once you control for everything else, are too small to be meaningful. And while the model I just showed you does suggest that 80 to 85% of the total between school variance and math score levels is just explained differences across schools in students' baseline test scores and socio-demographics, what remains is still substantial. One standard deviation increase in the elementary school value added estimate, that BLUP, is associated with a 0.3 standard deviation increase in the cohort's end of year math scores. Okay, this 0.3 standard deviation increase is seen based on middle school and high school value-added measures, so it's pretty large. However, it's crucial to think about not just the cross-sectional effect, but also the persistence of that effect, right? We can't expect that you'll be able to detect the 0.3 value-added estimate, the 0.3 standard deviation contribution to students' test scores a year later or a year or two later after they leave the school. However, in a paper I have with Tracy Lloyd, we find that schools' value-added effect estimates appear to be more persistent over time than teacher value-added estimates. So you can actually detect the school value-added estimate persisting at about 50% even 2, 3, 4 years after exposure to that school. And preliminary analyses I've done using a neighborhood survey. So this is just trying to check whether the school value-added estimates tell me anything about how those kids' skills develop over time. If I assign those value-added estimates to my sample in that study, I can still see relatively large effects of school value-added on those kids 6 to 8 years post-treatment. So I think there is some, suggestive evidence that what I'm detecting in is potentially meaningful. And one thing I'll note with the LA fans point is that if I just put in the average score level of the school, it tells me nothing about the children's skill trajectory, nor does the race or class composition of the school. It's only when I bring in this value added estimate do I start to see a school effect. As I mentioned before, if I disaggregate these estimates year to year and we saw them be very, if we saw a very low correlation year to year, we would be concerned that there's just noise. This matches up with my previous work using Massachusetts middle school data to show that year to year, there's about a 0.5 correlation in terms of what the school's value added estimate would be.
Jared,
yeah,
just one thought on the random versus school effects. I think if like part of your motivation for focusing on these data is that you just have like so much of it that it enables you to really precisely estimate the school value added, then that would, I think, kind of push you more towards like a fixed effects model.
That makes sense.
Where, you can still get accurate school value added estimates, like without kind of imposing some kind of distributional assumptions on those.
I like that idea. And I think that's probably a more intuitive way for a reader to information. So I like that. One thing that, again, made me less concerned about some of these decisions is that Dave Deming, in his 2014 paper, estimates value added using both random effects and fixed effects, and also cites other studies that show similarly that you get a very similar story regardless. But if it's a simpler model, I think, or a simpler interpretation, I think that's probably the way to go.
So I'm a little confused. You have to have a random coefficient, right?
Couldn't I just apply a school level fixed effect?
You can have a, so this is something I've been working, published for, fixed effects random coefficients. Fixed intercepts random coefficients.
Right, fixed intercept, right. So you're saying you would suggest-
It's just one way to go. I mean,
yeah.
There are some nice features of that model.
Yeah, I might want to
follow the random coefficient is the thing that's the essence of this, right? That's what
it's telling us.
You have to have a random coefficient, but you have to make I guess you have to pretty much make some kind of distributional assumption on that. Use the fixed intercept.
Right.
Yeah.
Jeff, what's your reaction?
So my understanding of this model is that since this is like, I mean, there's a lot of different models that get called value added models these days, but my understanding is that this is called the like conventional value added model, which is like it's basically a lag dependent variable model where you condition on achievement at time t-1, to predict achievement at time t, and then the value added is basically a school effect, right? Which gives you, you know, among schools starting at the same achievement, right? Who has higher achievement versus lower at time t+1. Treat that school effect as a random effect, then it would be like a random intercept model that would give you the school value added. And if you treat it as a fixed effect, you know, then basically you're just, you know, estimating a coefficient or a separate intercept for each school without any, you know, assumption on the distribution of those effects.
Well, the fixed effects would be extremely noisy with so few observations per school.
So that was one thing I wanted to ask. As a little, how many, so you have cohorts and grade, like cohort grade observations within schools.
Yep.
So like how many observations does that work out to within
So
school?
I have basically 24. All of these arrows are the number I have per school. So this is not all schools have full data for whatever reason, you know, they close, they open, etc. The ideal scenario is here we have 24 kind of year-to-year trajectory arrows. So if that's too few to get, you know, a trustworthy, you know, or a set of fixed effects that we're comfortable with, then maybe I stick with the random intercept or random slope.
It's not the number of students that's driving this, it's the number of time points per school.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is a huge number of
That's
students.
the problem. I am actually terribly confused, I must say, by this model that has this lag structure stacking these equations.
Okay.
I can understand doing a fixed effects, I mean, doing a value added model where we have 1 year, we're trying to pull out the adjusted mean for the school.
Yep.
When you've got these y's on both sides of the equation, you stack them up. I'm just trying to figure out what you're actually getting. And normally we wouldn't combine lagging and fixed. I wouldn't combine lagging effects or random effects in this way. I would have thought you want a growth curve for each school.
Mm-hmm. So the growth curve would mean the random slopes, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't use lagging. I don't.
Yeah, I see your point. Okay.
Because when you really just write this out,
yep,
got these things showing up first on the left side, then on the right side, and then on the left side, then on the right side.
Right. Yeah, I see your point.
I mean, maybe it's a good thing, but I just don't know what you get out of that.
Right. Now, I think the random slope approach addresses that, but would it be any better if instead of looking at these annual trajectories, I just looked at second graders in year 2004, 2005, and then looked how they did in fifth grade in the year 2000, 2008?
Yeah, you've got two different kinds of, there's two things going on, right? There's a school improvement, which is this year's second graders are better than last year's second graders. That's school improvement measure that you're hoping. But the other one is how much are kids learning as they get older within that school.
Right, and the latter is more what I'm interested in. My concern was that there's more of a risk of attrition across 3 years than across one, right? So like, is the group of students I'm comparing between second and fifth grade the same? Maybe, maybe not. Between second and third grade, it's probably a very similar set of students, but it sounds like it might be better just do the second to fifth grade, that full trajectory.
I guess I'm not understanding. Yeah, I guess I'm not clear. Are you stacking these things, or are you just doing this one step at it? You're just doing one step and then.
I'm stacking all of these yearly changes are stacked into the model. So I have basically these annual, you know, I have the 2005, 2006 and 2004, 2005 model for each cohort, and then across all of those years. So it's stacked. You have a bunch of combinations within each school. You have up to 28 stacked in. But I could slim it down to just be the number of student cohorts would be what? 8 per school rather than these 24 annual estimates per school.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, I would, in whatever comes of this paper, I mean, I would keep what you've done in there now, just because I think that's consistent with like how the economists are estimating these value added models. But I do think it would be a good idea to like, replicate this with the model that I think Steve has in mind, which would basically be like a growth curve model where you have an intercept at second grade, right? And then like a grade, let's say linear growth, right? And you have random, random school level for each of those things. And then you, in that model, you would school value added the school random effect on the growth rate from second to fifth grade. And you could adjust, you could use the year-to-year demographic or compositional characteristics to predict both both the levels and growth, right? As a way to get at the attrition issue.
That makes sense. So each school would have its own slope, right? And so right now they each have their own intercept, but then they would each have their own slope, right? So the steeper slope is the more the schools with a higher value added, right? That's like the basic interpretation.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one thing. The problem is, Jeff, this is not what the economists are doing. What they're doing is using individual data.
Right. Okay.
As in the 95 paper that you cited at the beginning, we showed how you can get the correct within school slope, and then you can adjust the dependent variable and look at for different kinds of kids to see what the school effect is. But without level 1 data, you're not really doing what we've called value added.
Right. I definitely see the shortcomings.
Different states have used these aggregated growth, the school as a school growing, not as the aggregate of the kids growing. But that's really not the same thing. So we should probably, we might want to exchange, I know this is a workshop that you want to get through. We might want to exchange, the three of us, some ideas.
Yes.
It's a really interesting question of how you do this. I know that I'm a little confused, so.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. I think I definitely have to revisit the model approach. Maybe I'll get lucky and California will give me the micro data. I'm still waiting to hear back from them on this.
Actually, Guanglei is doing some work on multiple cohorts. Maybe she would like to be involved with.
Well, I was looking at historical impact. So the relevancy here is, I think, no model you use, you probably want to add in year fixed effects anyway. What I mentioned earlier, year fixed effects, because there might be system-wide change from year to year, that will affect their percentiles.
I actually, that's an important point. I actually do use year fixed effects in these models and should have mentioned that. But again, all these points are really well taken. I think there's additional work to be done here to make the value-added estimates defensible. But one thing I do want to also show is that there are a lot of these changes on the margin to the model. You're getting very, very highly correlated results, right? So we can get better results, but I would be surprised if I got a dramatically different set of value-added estimates, not only based on my own data, but based on, like Dave Deming does, like 4 or 5 different specifications to assess value added and gets to a similar conclusion regardless of how he does it.
Is he using aggregate data or individual data?
He's using individual data, and I agree with you, the individual data, like that's a key piece here that I'm missing. Now, again, Sean Reardon uses cohort data, and this Hanselman and Field piece uses cohort data. So I need to think more about whether the cohort data tell us nothing or whether the cohort data just tell us something broadly similar, right? I think that's what it comes down to, and I don't know the answer to that yet. And hopefully it'll be moot if I get the California micro data, but that's a hope right now. So I only have 5 more minutes, so I'm happy to come back to this offline, but also at the end of this presentation. I just want to make sure I give, the headline findings based on this, these sets of value added. At this point, every school, all 5,000 in California, all public schools, elementary schools, have one value added measure based on this methodology. Now I assign all the schools in my data set to one of 8 metro commuting zones. And within those commuting zones, I assign schools to either a core city district or a suburban district. So core city districts are those that contain the most schools within the metro area. So it won't be surprising that in Los Angeles, the core city district is LAUSD. San Diego and Sacramento, it's pretty clear. San Francisco is a little tricky because of Oakland and San Francisco, and I include both of those districts as core city schools. All schools outside of those boundaries are considered suburban. Okay, so I have 5,000 schools nested within 8 different metro commuting zones, and the theory here is that parents are making decisions primarily within metro areas, not across them. They're looking at, on the margin, would I rather send my kid to LAUSD or Beverly Hills, or other suburban school district? So if we just look at if we just look at descriptive statistics from the academic performance index, regardless of value added, what are the compositional measures of the school? There's a clear story here that core city schools, just in terms of averages, are more likely to have a high concentration of Black students, a high concentration of socioeconomically disadvantaged students, right, by about 0.6, 0.7 standard deviations if you kind of standardize all of the measures. Of course, the core city schools are much less likely to have high concentration of white students and highly educated parents. This is the story that most of the literature focuses on, that the New York Times is reporting on, et cetera. Crucially, the academic performance index is a test score based measure that's intended to be kind of a more objective measure that's not contaminated by race and class in terms of quality assessments. And here too, the suburban schools look better than the core city schools without question. There's about a 0.4 standard deviation difference on if you look at the average core city school versus the average suburban school. But the punchline, even if across these measures suburban schools look better, when we use the value added estimates, the story reverses. It's core city schools that appear on average to outperform suburban schools when we use plausibly causal estimates of their effectiveness. Now, the gap is not huge, but it's 0.3 standard deviations when we think about the full distribution of value added. Okay, so that's just the descriptive pattern. But again, since the key here is to think about parent decision-making processes, I wanted to model the comparison in a way that's more realistic. So using a 2-level HLM that predicts school-level value-added estimates, at level 1 is the school nested within commuting zones, and I apply commuting zone fixed effects to emulate those real residential mobility decisions, right? Because people are looking primarily within, not between commuting zones. Even in this model, I basically show a similar story. Once I pull all commuting zones and all schools together, the suburban dummy indicator generates a coefficient of negative 0.22, suggesting it's 2.2 standard deviations lower on the value added distribution than core city schools. When I control for differences in suburban and core city neighborhoods disadvantage, it's a similar story. Control for charter magnet school type, that doesn't explain the core city versus suburban difference. In fact, there's some evidence that the suburban core city disparity increases. So it's not the story I told about charter schools being concentrated in core city neighborhoods. That's not what's going on here. One thing I look at is heterogeneity by large versus small commuting zones. And the idea here is that we really think about this core city versus suburban dichotomy primarily as a large metro phenomenon, whether it's New York, LA, Chicago. We're thinking less about places like Bakersfield and more about places like LA, San Francisco, San Diego, et cetera. And you see the suburban disadvantage on school value added to be evident in those large metros and not in the small ones, which again is kind of counter to that popular conception. Lastly, what I wanted to do is stratify the sample by different neighborhood types, because again, people are not only choosing across all schools within a metro area, they're probably honing in on neighborhoods that look broadly similar in terms of race and class advantage. So if we just specify the model for the most advantaged neighborhoods and compare suburban and core city schools there, again, we see that negative 0.3 standard deviation suburban disadvantage. And it's pretty similar across the board, but it's really the high and middle income neighborhoods where we see, these are not statistically different, but you see kind of these large suburban disadvantage gaps. And these are exactly the places where we might think highly motivated parents try to sort their kids into suburban schools. Okay, so just as a means of wrapping up, I know I'm pretty much out of time here. I wanted to bring us back to this core visual that helps motivate the page. We've seen income segregation increase among families with children, and we think a lot of this has to do with the desire to end up in suburban schools. However, this key driver of residential segregation, school quality, may reflect misperceptions of school quality than the reality of suburban schools being superior. And so in a way, we might see a difference between attempted versus actual opportunity. And stratification scholarship has to really kind of probe this opportunity hoarding strategy more thoroughly. It's possible that parents are sorting on things other than school quality, and that's what's driving intergenerational reproduction and segregation. There are some other implications here in terms of what we can learn about neighborhood effects and educational policy, but I'm happy to talk about that more as part of a dialogue. The point, urban schools are really not all they're cracked up to be. We need to think differently across a range of literatures in how we talk about the spatial distribution of opportunity. So I'll end there and happy to talk through these theoretical and policy implications as well as limitations. And thank you for your attention. I know it's been a long talk.
Great, thank you so much. Let's give Dr. Schachner a round of applause for a really great talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who would like to continue this chat, who have more questions, you can feel free to stay after in this same Zoom meeting where some of us are going to hang around and keep chatting. And please do join us again next week at the same time for our last workshop of the quarter. We have Assistant Professor Dr. Christina Groger from Lake Forest College coming to speak with us. So we hope to see you then.